Greetings all, and welcome to the 8th episode of the V.T.P, or the Veteran Trainer's Perspective. Today, we are going to be taking a look at one of the most fundamental aspects of the Pokémon world, and try to understand it in the context of how and why this aspect of the series functions the ways it does, and what it really represents in the series, as well as how it has evolved over time. Today, we are going to be taking a look at the elemental types that are assigned to Pokémon, and the attributes that they have that help to make them one of the most important aspects of Pokémon biology and the competitive metagame. First of all, it must be noted that, while we have a total of 18 different types today, this was not always the case, as in the beginning, there were only 15 types present, and only 13 of them were actually of any real offensive note in the games. Moreover, early on, the types also dictated the types of offense that could be delivered with them, as some were assigned as purely physical types, while others were assigned as only being special types. In particular, the normal, flying, fighting, bug, poison, ground, rock, and ghost types were all considered to be physical types, while the grass, fire, water, ice, electric, psychic, and dragon types were all considered to be special types. The ghost and dragon types in particular were completely useless for the most part, as the only stab ghost type attack known in Gen 1 was Lick, and the dragon type had no moves of such stature, so the types were mainly only there to exist for defensive purposes. And even then, the types were initially only featured in a single family, and thus were gimmick types at best. Even those that had some moves to them were not always viable at all, for the bug and poison types basically had no real powerful moves that allowed them to make much of an impact. So yeah, things were not really all that balanced in Generation 1, and the Psychic type reigned supreme since it didn't have any viable weaknesses that could readily be utilized to take them down. This changed in Generation 2, however, with the addition of two new types, the Dark and Steel types, the former of which was a special type and the latter a physical type, prior to the physical special split in Generation 4. These two types helped to balance the metagame by targeting the Psychic type, though most of the Pokémon assigned to these types, at the time, didn't have a lot of options to work with in terms of viable Pokémon to battle with. This remained the same for most generations to follow it, but something that did emerge was the dominance of the Dragon type, which was only weak to itself and the Ice type back in the day, thus making it a very difficult type to handle in many cases. This was countered harshly in Generation 6 with the introduction of the last type known currently, the Fairy type, which balanced things out severely and not only providing another weakness to the Dragon type, but, more importantly, a type immunity to Dragon type attacks, which was a huge deal as Dragon type attacks can easily deal neutral damage against almost every other type known, minus the Steel type. In both cases, this led to the changing of types in at least some instances, with the Magnemite family going from pure electric types to electric steel in Generation 2 from Generation 1, and many Pokémon either having the Fairy type slapped onto them like the members of the Ralts family, or had their types completely changed, such as with the members of the Cleffa family, which went from pure normal types to pure Fairy types. This rebalanced type metagame is the same one that we see today, and it serves as a point of importance when it comes to not only competitive battling, but, more importantly, when it comes to understanding Pokémon as a whole and the amazing powers that they can possess. With that said, now we can move on to an extremely important question that needs to be asked. What even are the types? Well, to put it simply, the types are a fundamental aspect of Pokémon biology that help to determine the types of materials, energy forces, and the like that their bodies are not only weak or resistant against, but, more importantly, how their natural powers and abilities can affect others when used in a battle setting. These types define the biology of these creatures and act as symbols of the unusual powers that make Pokémon what they are, special creatures that are distinct in the kingdom of life from others as a result of the unusual powers they possess. Some of these creatures might be natural animals, others man-made creatures, and still others ethereal or supernatural beings and godlike deities that help to symbolize or even represent the fundamental forces of our planet and the greater universe as a whole. Each of the types represents some aspect of the natural world and how it has become a part of Pokémon over time as a tool of defense, offense, or merely an aspect of their metaphysical forms. The variety of ways these types interact and exist among others is incredible, and are usually used to define a general, overarching series of creatures whose powers might otherwise vary between each other, but share some sort of common ground that makes classification possible. The normal type is one that stands on its own as a base type, where there is no real elemental assignment that can be made, with its attacks and moves being defined as those that adhere to the most basic of move forms, and thus is a neutral type that has a huge number of Pokémon naturally assigned to it. The flying type is one defined by the presence of flight capabilities in many cases, or at least some sort of control over the air around a Pokémon. The fighting type is one born of those that have developed special techniques to break through armor and the defenses of otherwise rigid Pokémon readily. The grass type defines many plant-based Pokémon and those that otherwise have a strong connection to the natural plant world. The bug type defines most insect-like creatures and those that take on physical properties similar to them in terms of their powers and the defenses they have access to in exoskeletons and things of the sort. The poison type is one defined by the use of powerful toxins to deal damage and tends to be rather notorious for its association with the poisoned and badly poisoned status conditions. The fire type is defined by the use of fire or extremely high temperatures at the very least to deal scorching damage to others, sometimes merely as a consequence of these creatures preferring to live in extremely hot environments. The ground type is attributed to an ability to absorb and diffuse electricity into the ground and use the earth itself as a weapon of war. The rock type is one of two types defined by the presence of armor, in this case rocky armor, and its attacks involve the use of stones in most cases to deal excessive blunt force trauma to others. The water type is attributed to those that live in the water naturally or that can otherwise use forceful blasts of water to deal damage, and is actually the most common type known. The ice type is one that involves the use of frigidly cold temperatures to deal damage and is usually associated with Pokémon that prefer extremely cold temperatures in their native environment, acting as the polar opposite of the fire type. The electric type is defined by those that can wield pure electricity as a weapon and are often notorious for the paralysis status conditions and the stunning power of the type's attacks against those that are not fully grounded. The steel type is the other type defined by the presence of armor, in this case metallic armor, and emphasizes the use of light energy and metal-coated body parts to attack and defend with, and is in truth the strongest defensive type of them all. The psychic type is a strange one that is defined by the use of psychokinetic forces to attack, and while this type might not seem to have much place in reality, psychic power is still something purported to exist, so it at least has some semi-factual base. The ghost type defines creatures that are, appropriately, ghosts or spirits of some sort, and go beyond the realm of the physical alone to exist as powerful entities that can use the end of life itself as a catalyst for offense in battle. The dark type is a tricky one to understand, but it can be said that it is essentially supposed to be an evil type that defines the darkest and cruelest forms of attack in the series and the nightmarish darkness that lies in the hearts and minds of everyone. The dragon type is another that is hard to really define and is more of an aspect of fantasy than it is fact, with the creatures assigned to the type being linked somehow to the mythology of dragons and possessing quite a few resistances that make it a hard type to take down. And lastly, in a similar vein, the fairy type is one that is fantastical entirely in nature and represents a more mystical force in the series, with creatures that seem magical in their powers and abilities, and thus fall into a realm of fantasy that mortals in the real world could never normally experience. Now, with so many types known, it would seem that there would have to be at least one type that dominates the others and serves as the most powerful of them all. But in truth, this is not the case, and never completely has been, for the different types have at least some sort of balance in place as a fundamental aspect of their existence. In saying this, I am referring to the fact that the games are designed to have the types face off from each other in a rock-paper-scissors style. What I mean by this is that the different types have their own unique strengths and weaknesses from both a defensive and offensive perspective, and this is completely intentional, as it serves as a serious point of strategy when deciding how a trainer wishes to battle and the kinds of Pokémon they would like to use. While the actual powers and strengths of Pokémon are different for every individual, barring a few changes in the metagame, which will be covered later, these strengths and weaknesses have remained constant for the types and never change fundamentally no matter what Pokémon is being described, so they serve as a useful base for strategizing and learning how to make the most of certain Pokémon in a fight. This is also what forms the primary competitive aspects of the series and is so ingrained in the metagame that without it, there really wouldn't be a metagame at all. Unfortunately, this was still sort of the case in Generation 1, and while there were at least 15 types to start off with, 2 of them, as already mentioned, really had no place offensively in the meta, and another 2, the bug and poison types, were effectively useless in that regard as well, so things have not always been that balanced. Even so, this mentality has helped to shape the use of these types and their assignment to Pokémon, and as a whole, helps to make or break many Pokémon that might otherwise have different stats and move lists that can render them either incredibly useful or pointless from a competitive standpoint when their type assignment is also taken into consideration. At the same time in saying that there is a balance between the different types, there is not an equal balance in regards to the commonness of the different types, and this can really be chalked up to the real-world basis for many of the types. For one thing, the fact that the water type is the most common of all the types is not really all that surprising, as most of our planet is covered in water, and most of the creatures that live on it are aquatic in nature, with untold numbers of organisms that have yet to be identified and classified in the oceans of the real world. The normal type comes in second, and this too makes sense, as a lot of Pokemon just have plain ordinary animalistic attributes that make them very close in form to non-Pokemon animals, if you believe they exist in the Pokemon world somehow, or at the very least reflect the ubiquitous nature of its plain form. From these two downward, it can be seen that there is a common pattern in that many of the more basic elemental attributes, such as those that are defined by their physical characteristics or otherwise basic elemental types, tend to be on the more common side, while those that specialize in more exotic attributes, like the Ghost, Dark, and Dragon types, are less common as a result of little being known or even speculated towards regarding the origins of their powers and presence in the world of Pokemon. It can be said, though, that this trend is bucked by at least two types, the Psychic and Ice types, respectively, but there is still reason for this. The exotic nature of the Psychic type means that it should be among the less common of types, but there is a saying that everyone has some sort of hidden psychic power within them. In that regard, the unusual commonness of the type has at least some basis. As for the Ice type, the fact that it is in fact the least common type of all might seem a bit odd, but in reality, not many types of life are perfectly adapted to extreme cold, and more importantly, chemical reactions that are endothermic in nature or require energy to be drawn from the environment to work are rare in nature and require unusual circumstances to work, so the fact that few Pokemon can do so as their primary offensive attribute is not terribly surprising. In my opinion though, this does make the metagame more interesting, as it can help make preparing for these less common types, at least defensively, trickier, and helps to create a struggle in offensive coverage towards more common types versus less common types, and thus introduces another interesting wrinkle into many battle strategies that makes the competitive metagame intriguing and difficult to easily conquer. Now, if this was all there was to the metagame and the series itself, then it would definitely make for an interesting game. But this is not nearly as complex as it really is, and that can be assigned to one other attribute that makes the system of type assignments incredibly intriguing and a true test of strategy on the parts of all. The existence of dual types. A lot of Pokemon are considered to be pure types, meaning that the elemental attributes that they are strongest in are defined by a single type, and so the way in which they can maximize their offensive attributes and defensive specialties is pretty straightforward. However, at the same time, there are many species of Pokemon that actually have two types assigned to them. These creatures are dual types, and they arise because many Pokemon have natural powers and abilities that they specialize in that cover the attributes of more than one type, and because they can utilize multiple types more effectively than what would be otherwise expected, it is impossible to simply categorize them as a single type, requiring a dual type assignment to be given to reflect their full list of specialty attributes. This is the ultimate double-edged sword when it comes to battling because, on the one hand, while having a dual type assignment means that a Pokemon can have access to two different stab types to work with in a fight and can gain some resistance and negate weaknesses to one of their types depending upon the attributes of the other, in the same vein it also increases the number of weaknesses they have in some cases and can set up disastrous scenarios where they might be doubly weak to a type, meaning that even a weak attack from that type can put them down easily. Because these sorts of combinations can prove to make or break a Pokemon in some cases, paying close attention to them can often be incredibly important and pertinent to forming a good team that can make the most of their natural attributes without always succumbing to the doubled issues it might have as a result of having two different types. As a whole though, these types of Pokemon are generally the ones to be feared the most, as the pairing of certain types together can help to eliminate some serious weaknesses, such as Pokemon like Quagsire and Swampert being completely immune to electric-type attacks, one of only two types the water type is weak against, though in that same vein, it is balanced by them being doubly weak to grass-type attacks. Whether or not the benefits of a dual-type assignment are worth it depends very much on what else a Pokemon can bring to the table, but it is nonetheless a staple that trainers will have to get used to for many species of Pokemon. With this double-edged sword in place, it seems like this would effectively explain everything and make the metagame a bit easier to understand. But there are two things that should be noted here before concluding this little examination of type assignments. First of all, and the thing that is most often asked by so many is, why only two? Why not have a Pokemon that can have 3 types or even more? Why limit it to just 2? Well, from my perspective, I think that this is in play simply for the sake of simplification and making things easier to work with. Having to consider the weaknesses and resistances of two types together requires a lot of memorization of type weaknesses and resistances alone, and is a chore, as the two different types have to be matched to each other to figure out what moves are still effective against an opponent with multiple types. So to add another type in there would only serve to clutter things even more and make it very difficult to properly strategize when facing an opponent with more than one type assignment. And considering how complicated the games are as it is, having that kind of wrinkle can make it very difficult to make proper teams, and as a whole, I feel that it would be more of a hassle than anything really worth it, especially since having a triple stab feature could additionally be seen as unfair to some. Now, this isn't to say that the concept has not been experimented with before, but these are under special circumstances. The Forced Curse and Trick-or-Treat techniques add an additional Grass or Ghost type assignment to opponents, respectively, but these moves are exclusive to a single family each, so they are not horribly broken and do require a turn to set up to even make them work. Furthermore, Del Mise has the ability to get stab from 3 different types, but that is only thanks to its signature ability, Steelworker, which grants it Steel type stab bonuses in addition to the Grass and Ghost type ones that it already has natural access to. But because it is an ability, it can be switched off. It only applies to damage from its own attacks and not defensively, and it's isolated to Del Mise only, so it is balanced in that regard. So, the way it stands now, only having 2 types maximum per Pokemon under normal circumstances seems fair and helps to keep the metagame as a whole fairly structured. Lastly, it is interesting to note that the weaknesses and resistances possessed by different types has not always been the same, and has changed fundamentally in some cases in reflection of the actual elemental properties of the types. First of all, the bug and poison types have a bizarre shared history that shows the way in which insectoids and the like handle toxins. In Generation 1, the poison type actually dealt super effective damage against the bug type, likely because it was thought that toxins like pesticides are used primarily to kill these sorts of creatures. At the same time, however, the poison type was also weak against the bug type in a contradictory fashion, possibly as a reflection of the fact that some insect groups are known to grow stronger and resistant to toxins over time. In Generation 2, this was changed, so the poison type started to receive restricted damage from the bug type, and the bug type equally became resistant to the poison type, making the relationship more stable and understandable. In Generation 1, the fire type took neutral damage from the ice type, likely under the thought that fire and ice should equally counter each other. However, it makes more sense for fire to be able to melt ice readily, so in Generation 2, things were changed so the fire type became resistant to the ice type. In Generation 1, the psychic type oddly enough used to be immune to the ghost type, which makes sense in some regards since those with strong minds might be able to resist the fearful effects of ghost type attacks. But this made little sense as it was contradicted heavily by the Pokemon anime of all things, as it was said that ghost types were actually effective against psychic types. The system was changed in Generation 2 to reflect this, as the psychic type suddenly became weak to the ghost type, and new moves like Shadow Ball suddenly had a reason to exist and became a staple of the metagame as a ready way to shut down psychic types. The most recent change comes from the Steel type. The Steel type is one that has always been renowned as the best type defensively as a result of its numerous resistances, but from its introduction up through Generation 5, 2 of those resistances against the Ghost and Dark types helped to make it a serious threat even against these rare types, and made Pokemon like Metagross a serious nightmare to deal with. Starting in Generation 6, however, the type was rebalanced and its resistances to those 2 types were removed, allowing the Ghost and Dark types to now deal neutral damage to the type, likely because these 2 types use energy forces, the incarnation of the spirit world and evil itself, respectively, that should not be so readily blocked by something as simple as basic metal. Finally, it should be noted that there is one other type that once existed, but no longer does. The Mystery type. This strange type only existed to define the curse technique as a result of the abnormal effects it had depending upon the type of Pokemon using it, with it having a completely different effect on ghost types using it compared to the other present types. This was changed so it was just a ghost type move starting in Generation 5 after originally debuting in Generation 2, and the type was lost forever. Which, to be honest, isn't a huge loss since it really had no defining use in the games anyways. With that, this concludes our examination of the elemental types that are assigned to Pokemon, and the part they have to play in the competitive metagame of the series and their history with the games as a whole. It is unknown to me if they will ever add any more types to the series, but for now, I think that the 18 we have will suffice, and help to keep the games fair and balanced in their current state. And if more are added in the future, then there would definitely be much to discuss with them, and how they might impact the metagame further, and work to make the art of competitive battling that much more complicated and intriguing. That's the end of this episode, so keep your ears open and ready to tune in to the next episode of the V.T.P. Thank you all for watching this video. It is always an honor to be able to speak with you all on the subject of Pokemon in a way that brings me great joy and happiness in my work. If you would like to keep tabs on past and future work, click that subscribe button, check out my work on DeviantArt, and don't be shy about following me on Twitter, where you can find pertinent announcements on upcoming work before it is officially posted. Links to both can be found in the video description. If you would like to support my work and help Miguel and I continue to produce more content for you and improve upon our presentation, please visit us at my Patreon page, which you can also find a link to in the video description.
No.
With that, I thank you for watching and I wish you well.